Avez-vous déjà lu ou entendu que nous descendions de l'homme de Néandertal? Eh bien, c'est une découverte de Svante Pääbo. Il est avec nous aujourd'hui ici à l'ULiège pour recevoir le titre de docteur honoris causa. Hello, Svante Pääbo.
Hello, very happy to be here. Yeah.
It's a pleasure to meet you. We're going to talk about.
Nous avons 15 minutes pour parler de vous et de vos recherches, alors nous allons commencer avec votre découverte la plus connue, celle qui prouve que notre ADN a un peu de l'homme de Néandertal dans sa structure. Comment avez-vous découvert cela?
Well, so what we worked on for many years was to develop methods to retrieve DNA, genetic material from old bones. And then when we had worked those methods out in the early 2000s, we focused on the Neanderthal, which is the closest evolutionary relative of everyone alive today. And then when we had the first version of that genome, we were very surprised to find that it shared more genetic variants with people outside Africa than inside Africa. So if your roots are in Europe, for example, you share more genetic variants with the Neanderthal than if your roots are in Africa. And the interpretation of that has since been borne out, is that when modern humans left Africa something like 50,000 years ago, they met Neanderthals, they had babies together, and those babies were successful enough to in turn have babies in modern human societies and be part of our ancestry today.
Est-ce que les Néandertaliens nous ont apporté des avantages?
Any benefits?
So these genetic variants from Neanderthals have come over to present-day people then, and we carry different variants. So you probably carry different Neanderthal variants than I do. And some of these are beneficial to us, and some can be bad for us.
Which one?
Lesquels sont bénéfiques pour nous?
For us.
Well, for example, there is one variant of a receptor for a hormone, progesterone, and that variant makes that the receptor is more highly expressed. And that's important in women during pregnancy, because it protects that variant against, lessens the risk of miscarriages early on in pregnancy. So that's clearly a variant that is very good to carry if it comes from Neanderthals.
There is bad variants.
Il y a donc aussi des mauvais variants. Vous l'avez démontré dans une de vos recherches que vous avez menées sur la Covid-19. Certains patients avec un gène hérité des Néandertaliens avaient moins de chances face à la maladie. C'est très surprenant. Comment avez-vous découvert cela?
This is very surprising. How did you get to that?
Well, so during the early pandemic, it became clear that there must be not only the risk factors we all know, old age, male sex, and so on, but other risk factors that influence why certain people become very ill and others hardly ill at all when they're infected. So we were a little bit involved in a big international consortium to look for genetic risk factors in the people who got infected. And we were very surprised to find that the biggest genetic risk factor is a variant that comes from Neanderthals on our chromosome 3. And if you carry the Neanderthal version there and get infected with the virus, at least early on in the pandemic, you were 2 or 3 times more likely to become severely ill or die from the virus. So that's certainly a variant that is, in that circumstance, not good to carry from the Neanderthal.
All of these discoveries lead you to further research.
Toutes ces découvertes vous ont mené à découvrir une nouvelle espèce qui s'approche de l'Homo sapiens, les Denisoviens.
Like Denisovans.
Je le prononce bien?
It's right.
Yes.
Les Denisoviens, qui sont-ils?
So that came back in 2010 when we studied a small little bone that the archaeologists had found in southern Siberia in a cave called Denisova Cave. And when we looked at the genome of that individual, we were very surprised to find that it was not a Neanderthal, it was not a modern human, it was something that shared a common ancestor with Neanderthals, but very far back, something like 400,000 years ago or so. So we realized we had sort of discovered a now extinct form of humans simply from a genome sequence, not We didn't know how their skeletons look, we didn't know what stone tools they produced, etc. So we called them then Denisovans after this site where they were formed, just like Neanderthals are named after Neandertal, where they were first found. And since one had learned that they, for example, have in turn contributed DNA to people who live in Asia today.
Okay, so
D'accord, donc ici en Europe, nous n'avons pas ou peu de gènes de Denisoviens.
of Denisovans.
Exactly. So in Europe, if your roots are here in Europe, you carry Neanderthal DNA on your chromosomes. In Asia, they have the Neanderthal component, but in addition, this Denisovan component. And in some part of Asia, such as Papua New Guinea, up to 5% of the genome of people come from Denisovans.
Comment vous êtes-vous senti quand vous avez découvert cela?
I think when we first saw this contribution from Neanderthals, the first thought was that I was actually very surprised. And we worked quite a long time to exclude all possible errors that we could have made, you know, if we had contaminated it with European DNA in some sense or so. Then it's actually cool, I think, that the Neanderthals, if you like, are not totally extinct. They live on a little bit in many people today.
C'est très cool, oui, vous avez raison.
So I found
J'ai également découvert avant cette interview que vous aviez caché vos recherches sur l'ADN ancien au départ.
on ancient DNA.
Vous les avez cachées.
So it's quite interesting.
Donc c'est assez intéressant. Pensez-vous que les grandes découvertes sont faites avec un état d'esprit rock'n'roll?
With a rock and roll mindset.
Vous pensez?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was when I started this, most people would have said DNA doesn't survive for many years. It's such a sensitive molecule and so on. And I was rather afraid of my professor when I was a graduate student. I was afraid that he would simply forbid me to try to do this. So I did it late at night and on weekends when no one else was in the laboratory. This all started.
Do you advise the young researcher?
Conseillez-vous aux jeunes chercheurs, comme vous l'étiez, de faire des choses comme ça, de cacher la vérité à certains professeurs et à d'autres s'ils ont une grande idée, comme vous l'aviez?
Well,
If you have a great idea like you did.
I would like to think that I'm more relaxed so that they dare tell me. But certainly I think that a part of being a scientist is almost taking a pleasure in questioning perceived wisdom. To sort of say, oh, everybody is probably wrong, probably the other way. The problem is, of course, that rather often you are wrong yourself when you say that. So it's sort of a balance of...
Okay.
Yeah.
Which advice?
D'accord. Quel conseil donnez-vous aux jeunes chercheurs s'ils vous le demandent?
If they ask it to you.
Well, I think that the only thing I would say is I think the reason to do research is that you find it interesting and enjoy it. So you should sort of follow the things you think are cool, that you think are interesting. Then at least you have a good time while you do it. And you know, if you're lucky, it also turns out to be important or so.
It's a key that
C'est une clé qui vous conduit à de grandes idées et à de grandes découvertes?
discoveries.
Yeah, I think sort of following your interests and your passion is sort of important in this thing, because you're really not in it for the money or for that you're into it because you're fascinated by what you do.
When you have a
Quand on a un prix Nobel, est-ce que c'est toujours un plaisir de recevoir un titre comme docteur honoris causa?
title like Dr. Honoris Causa.
Yes, certainly. I feel quite honored to be here and receive this honor from the University of Liège today.
Okay.
Est-ce que vous collaborez ou est-ce que vous avez déjà collaboré avec l'Université de Liège?
So actually, one of the people that I've worked with before for many years, Annelina Pinson, is on the faculty here. So that is really the person I know the best at the university here.
Have you
Avez-vous déjà travaillé ici en Belgique sur des recherches?
in Belgium on some research?
Yes, so I mean, Belgium is a great country in terms of Neanderthals because there are many famous Neanderthal sites here. So we have worked on DNA from Neanderthal remains in Spy and Goyer, for example, also modern humans in Goyer and Neanderthals. We have looked very hard, for example, among these late Neanderthals from Belgium to see if there's any contribution from modern humans into them. And I failed to find that so far, but one day one might be successful even with that.
Pensez-vous qu'il existe d'autres néandertaliens et dénisoviens? Y a-t-il d'autres espèces de ce genre qui n'ont pas été encore découvertes?
Well, we know about some. I mean, we know about these hobbits in Indonesia, for example, which are short-statured hominins with very small brains that are probably an earlier divergence on the human lineage. And we are currently working with people in Indonesia quite hard to see if perhaps we can retrieve DNA from those. I'm sure there are other things. It's very unclear in Asia if sort of fossils that are in museums in China, for example, are Denisovans or are something else. And I think that will become clear in the next few years when we get DNA from them. Africa is another very fascinating place where we so far have no DNA yet from extinct forms of humans. But I'm pretty sure that when modern humans spread across Africa, they also mixed with other forms of humans there. And one will learn about that in the future.
What do you hope?
Qu'espérez-vous pour l'avenir de la paléogénétique au niveau mondial?
Well, in our area, I think one thing that's really interesting is to try to get further back in time in human remains. And for example, the hobbits in Indonesia would be extremely fascinating. Another direction of research that we are very much into at the moment is to try to understand how everybody today, all humans, differ genetically from Neanderthals and Denisovans, our closest evolutionary relatives. And to see if some of those changes that have spread to almost everyone today have consequences, perhaps consequences for how we behave or how we think or things like that, because modern humans are rather special.
Merci, professeur Pääbo.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.